So it wasn't an isolated issue. After the early church grew and became large and more organized, people lost touch with the truth of the gospel message. People in power did not provide access to the scriptures, especially to people who were not as educated and couldn't read Greek and the Septuagint. What was that in Latin?
Well, no, the Septuagint was in Greek. It was later translated into Latin Vulgate.
Vulgate. But the only ones that were allowed to read it were the church leaders. And the only one that were allowed to interpret it were the church leaders. And so because of that, a lot of the sin nature of all of us, the leaders in the early church, spun things for their benefit. And specifically, what was the one about paying penance? Indulgences. And so along comes Martin Luther, who was a Catholic monk, and he had a very sensitive spirit and was very, very sad about the sin in his life. And so he was constantly tormented by the sin in his life and was doing all the indulgences and was constantly failing. And finally, he discovered the gospel message because he learned how to read. He was very educated, and he began to read the Greek. And in the Greek, there was a word, metanoia, which had been translated into something about penance. I didn't put that in my notes.
It was penance.
It was, and so it meant something completely different. And yet metanoia meant something different. Anyway, Luther saw this contradiction and repentance. I'm just going to go on.
Okay.
Luther, because the kids are getting. Luther saw this contradiction in what the scripture was saying and how the church was applying it, and how it was actually creating a burden to the people, that they were burdened with these indulgences, and there was really no sense of forgiveness or freedom. And so, oops, what happened? Can I give him an Apple iPad?
Nicely, Steve.
Nearly 500 years ago, an unknown monk from a backward town in Germany, he set in motion a movement that would literally transform Western civilization. His name was Martin Luther. You know, I love what he said. He said, "I never thought such a storm would rise out of Rome over a simple scrap of paper." But it did. Because he set free the gospel of Jesus Christ, a gospel that had been held captive for nearly 1,200 years by a church and by a book.
So Martin Luther was instrumental at freeing the gospel to the people. And he was greatly persecuted because of it. But it wasn't much unlike the Old Testament history, the bondage of the Old Testament that we saw, or the bondage of the Galatians. How in the Old Testament, how they kept going back to Egypt or kept going back to old ways instead of accepting God's provision for them. And the Galatians forgot what it meant to be free.